We are going to go to Exodus chapter 4. Today we're going to be continuing as we talk about the story of Moses and all that as we kind of go through this whole story in Exodus. We've seen a lot of things and we're going to kind of look at some interesting stuff today. So as we look back at the week that has been, this church is a place for confession, right? Yeah? All right. You guys don't even want to confess that. All right. How many of you would say, I probably or maybe possibly ate too much on Thanksgiving Day? A couple of us. Yeah, I definitely did. I enjoyed the pie portion of the dinner thoroughly. You know what I mean? Thanksgiving is a wonderful time, and there is a lot of food, delicious. And, you know, as I was thinking about this morning and what we're going to look at this morning, I got thinking about Thanksgiving dinner. Because the actual dinner, the eating part of dinner, doesn't last all that long. You know, 20, 30 minutes, everybody's eating pretty much everything they can eat, you know, and then it's like there's all this food staring at you, and you're like, why did we make all this food? We can't possibly take another bite. And then dessert comes out, and suddenly you could take another bite. But getting ready for Thanksgiving dinner takes an awful lot longer than 30 minutes. Yeah, there we go. Bless those who put in the time and the energy and the effort. And I thought about it like this. I thought, you know, if there was an alien who showed up who didn't know anything about eating or what nourishment and all that stuff for us, and they just came and observed all this stuff we're doing on Thanksgiving before we get to the eating part, I wonder how, like, if they would have any idea of what this all was for, what the point of it was. Because everything we're doing looks nothing like what we're going to do. You know what I mean? You're cutting these things up and you're putting these things together and you're beating things with mixers and you're doing all kinds of stuff, putting things in ovens and whatever, but it doesn't look anything like what we're going to do later on. And the reason I thought about that is because today we're going to be talking a little bit about how God puts us through a process of preparation. Preparation in our lives often looks nothing like the final purpose. Usually it lasts a lot longer. And oftentimes, it's a lot more work. Now, there are times where your preparation looks like the final purpose. And you know, if you're doing homework for a class, I remember in college, there was a lot of like exercises with calculus and things like that, where you're doing the same thing over and over again because that's what's going to be on the test. And so you can kind of make the connection pretty easily in some things. But I would say for lots and lots of things, what you're doing in preparation looks nothing like what it will look like when it comes to the moment of purpose. But preparation is essential to purpose. And sometimes because we don't know the purpose, we cannot figure out what this is preparing us for. It's kind of like we don't understand what's going on in our lives. Have you ever been through one of those really tough times in life where you said, God, why? Why is this happening? Why are you doing this? And of course, our faith says, well, we need to trust God, but we're like, what in the world? I don't understand. I would ask today, based on what we're going to look at in Moses' life, what if that happens because we're in preparation or formation, and it doesn't look a lot like what it's going to produce yet? And so our why is really a confession of the fact that we don't see clearly enough to understand. What if we find ourselves in a place where what we're going through seems to have no purpose, but it's because we're not at the purpose yet? We're just in preparation. And what if preparation is a lot longer and harder than the purpose? What if God knows what it takes to get us from here to the place where our purpose is fulfilled? And what if God knows how hard it needs to be so that we will be ready for the things that he wants to do with our lives, whether by the time it happens, we are still here or not? We're going to look at a story today in Exodus 4 that's really interesting. And I would say as we read some of this, part of the story that we'll read is why people decide, I'll never understand the Bible. So it's going to be, I'll tell you, as we read some of this, you're going to be like, what in the world is that? So we'll get to that. But stepping back from it and recognizing what's the way that this is presented, it is a story arc. And in this arc of story, God is preparing Moses for his purpose. And one of the things that Moses needs in preparation for his purpose is that his faith gets stretched. that God takes the faith that Moses has and says, this needs to be bigger. And so he begins to pull at Moses' faith. I'd say no matter what is happening in your life right now in preparation, part of it is that God is doing that same thing to you. He is stretching your faith. He is making you uncomfortable and putting you through difficulties so that your ability and the faith muscle, if you will, is stronger than it ever has been. And your ability to trust him grows, and you need your faith to grow. You need it because your connection to your Creator is through your faith. So if you want a stronger connection to God, that connection happens as your faith gets stronger. And as your faith gets stronger and your connection with God gets more deep and more powerful, then the things that God produces in our life happen more and more. Things like joy begin to produce in our lives as our faith gets stronger. It's a weird thing that through suffering or hardship or heartache that our faith gets stronger, and that allows us, it gives us more capacity to enjoy and be filled with life and peace. More things that we desperately need, but it happens through a process that is hard and uncomfortable and scary. And sometimes just makes you want to quit. So if you're one of those people that find yourself wanting to quit, I'm going to bring you to Moses. Moses is here having a conversation with God, and he's had a conversation with God for a long time. Back in chapter 3, we started this. Now we're almost finishing up chapter 4, and so there's this long, long conversation that Moses has had with God. And as Moses leaves this conversation is where we pick up this story in Exodus chapter 4, verse 18. It says this, "Then Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, 'Let me return to my own people in Egypt to see if any of them are still alive.' Jethro said, 'Go, and I wish you well.' Now the Lord had said to Moses in Midian, 'Go back to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead.' So Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and started back to Egypt, and he took the staff of God in his hand. The Lord said to Moses, 'When you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says, Israel is my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go, that he may worship me. But you refused to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son.'" So we got Moses, after a couple of weeks ago, we saw Moses basically say, "Please, God, send somebody else." And God says, "No, I'm sending you." So Moses leaves that conversation with God. And I think what Moses is doing here between here and when he gets to Egypt and he starts to do what God has called him to do is kind of showing us humbly how God was preparing him for the job God had called him to, for the purpose that God had given. And so we find Moses going back to his father-in-law and saying, "I need to leave. I'm going to take my wife and my sons and I'm going to go back to Egypt." But he doesn't say what happened, and he doesn't say really why. What he says is, "I'm going to go back to my people in Egypt to see if any of them are still alive." And we don't know why he said that. Is he just being polite? Is he just giving a polite excuse? But it's interesting because that's not why God told Moses to go back. He didn't tell him to go back to see if any of God's people were alive. He told him to go back because I'm going to set my people free through you. You are going to deliver my people. Even in the way that he worded that, to see if any of them are still alive, it's almost like Moses is saying now in his own head, I'm not really sure if any of them are even alive still. Maybe what I did way back when messed it up so bad that Pharaoh eventually just killed all of them. I don't know. It seems like Moses is doubting God. Like Moses is having trouble crossing that line. That I really believe that what God has told me is right. I really believe that God's plan is what's best for my life. Even though God told me to go back and free Israel, I'm not sure there's even any left. How about you? Have you sometimes doubted what God has told you in your life? You know, maybe you're a single person and Romans tells us all things work together for good, and you're like, yeah, but I just want to be with somebody. I just want to be married. I don't know about this plan for God in my life. God, why aren't you doing what I want you to do? Maybe you're in financial struggles and you're like, I'm just not sure, God, about your plan. You're like Moses. Moses is like, I'm not sure this whole plan with God thing is a great idea. Last time I was in Egypt, it wasn't such a good idea. Now I'm going back. I don't know what I think about all this. And God, instead of just coming at Moses and saying, forget you, I'm tired of you, uses this whole process to prepare Moses. I thought about this week, some of the longest conversations God has in the Bible with people are with people who are rejecting him, people who are doubting him. Like the prophets. Like read the book of Isaiah, read the book of Ezekiel, read the book of Jeremiah. These are long conversations with God's people who are rejecting him, and he's having, do you know how patient our God is with us? I'm so thankful that God is patient. And here we find Moses still, after meeting with God on the mountain of God in the burning bush and seeing the staff turn into a snake and his hand turn white as snow, and hearing the voice of God, Moses is like, I'm not sure about this. I think Moses is using this story to just tell us something rather than just say it straight out. He didn't want to go all in on this whole deliver Israel, follow God thing. When he went back to his father-in-law, he didn't want to tell his family what had happened. He wasn't sure what he thought about it. And even though he had said to God, please send someone else, God didn't let him off the hook. And so what we see here, I think, is that Moses does what we do. He says, well, I'm going to, see about this God stuff. I'm going to try it out a little bit. I'm going to see what happens, see if it works, see if it fixes my life, see if it makes everything better. I'm going to see what happens, but I'm definitely not ready to be on the line for it. I'm not going to go back to have a conversation with my father-in-law and say, hey, I just talked to God. Jethro's going to go, excuse me? You what? And Moses is not even sure what he thinks about it, so he just kind of shoves it off to the side. But Moses is taking some different actions than he took before. And his life is turning, and he doesn't even realize how much it's turned yet, but it's no small detail because he's being asked to accept that he's not a washed-up failure, but instead the deliverer of Israel. For decades, he has been hiding. He ran 40 years ago from Pharaoh, and now he's told he's going to go confront Pharaoh. 40 years ago, he had all kinds of confidence. Now he has none. God is at work in Moses, preparing him. And it takes time. I would say in your life, God is probably far more patient with your process of preparation than you are. Remember that. Because we get like, that's it, I'm done, enough, I've had it, God. When are we going to get somewhere good? And God is like, listen, I know how long it takes. Can you imagine if that happened on Thanksgiving and you put the turkey in the oven and you were like, how long is this going to take? And after an hour, you were like, forget it. I'm just taking it out and eating it. Yeah, you wouldn't be here today. You'd be in the hospital, right? We get it when it comes to something as simple as cooking a turkey, but we forget it when it comes to the spiritual preparation of our life. It takes time. And God knows how much time it takes. And God has patience with us. Sometimes patience we don't even have for ourselves. We'd like the payoff when we're still in the process. Moses is in the process here. And he's certainly not all the way there. He's not even all the way there in his faith yet. But the big change is that instead of Moses deciding what's going to happen, Moses is tentatively walking in the direction that God has given him. And in doing that, he is finding out how to let God direct and empower his life. He is learning, functionally learning how to trust God. And then he gives us a little more information. He says, God had said to Moses, go back, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead. He had already told Moses to go, but now we learn that he told Moses about this change in power, that the danger that was there before is not there now. Now, let me ask you something. Did God need the old Pharaoh to die in order for Moses to be safe when he went back to Egypt? Who needed to know that? Moses needed to know that. Why? Because Moses is scared. Moses has had a story playing in his head for 40 years, and God graciously doesn't say, well, just get over it, Moses. We're going back to Egypt. Who cares who's there? God says, listen, Moses, I know that one of the things that would just hold you back is this whole Pharaoh thing. I'm telling you, those who wanted to seek your life are dead. That thing is over. Come on, let's go. There's this gentleness to our Father. There is this goodness in helping us along. And so Moses begins this journey, taking up his wife and his sons, putting them on donkeys, and starting off towards Egypt. One of the things that's different here is we find out that these signs are not just for Israel, but they're for Pharaoh too. When God was talking to Moses back in chapter 3, it was all about when I get to Israel, even the beginning of chapter 4, when I get to the Israelites and I tell them that I've met you, they're not going to believe me. What do I do? And so God said, well, tell them my name is. And then later on, he said, here's some signs you can do. Now we find out that God says, not just in front of Israel, but also in front of Pharaoh. And it seems that even though it refers back to when he was on the mountain, that this was a later part of the conversation. Like, in other words, that maybe at first, Moses didn't need to be hearing about, I'm going to go talk to Pharaoh. Maybe God knew a digestible bite for him was, all right, we're going to go back, and you're going to talk to your people. And then later on, he's like, okay, and by the way, you're going to stop off at Pharaoh too. Now, Moses probably thought the big deal was going back to his people that he had run from. And what if they don't like me? And what if they reject me? And how am I going to lead them out? But the main story we remember from Moses is not Moses talking to the Israelites. It's Moses talking to Pharaoh and the plagues that come on Egypt. Sometimes, even as God is explaining to us what's going to happen, he doesn't tell us the whole thing because can you imagine what God's saying to Moses? Here's what you're going to do. You're going to march in to this powerful king and you're going to tell him, let my people go. And he's going to say no. And then you're going to march out and you're going to do all these amazing, incredible things. And it's going to take probably weeks and maybe months of back and forth with this most power. This was not where Moses was at that time. Moses was like, yeah, no. So God prepares him piece by piece, bite by bite. Some of our problem with preparation is we're not humble enough to realize that it takes time with our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses for God to get us where we need to go. And then God says to him something very interesting. He says, I am going to harden Pharaoh's heart. Little aside, without getting too theological, later on, we find it to be said that both Pharaoh hardens his heart and God hardens his heart. So I don't know how to reconcile all that, and I'm not sure we need to. Certainly, Exodus doesn't try to. So the sovereignty of God and the free will of man is not something that I can just give you a quick thing and you've got it. But the point is that this choice is going to drive God's outpouring of power in front of Egypt, but also in front of Israel. And it both sets Israel free and establishes a relationship with the Lord Israel carries for centuries. This hardening of Pharaoh's heart that brings about plague after plague after plague and final deliverance is something that establishes God's relationship with his people, Israel. That is not something, it would have just felt like, well, we did the frog thing and that didn't work. You know, we did the hail thing, that didn't work. I don't know, we're just failures. Sometimes God sends you to do something that doesn't work, and you're like, well, that was just a failure. See, here, it didn't work. But all that didn't work was this whole long process where there was this big, long story about God, how God persistently worked on behalf of his people so that his people would know when it comes into their own land and they become their own nation, that they could trust God to persistently work for them. It became a national identity, and it happened through a process over time. And it happened because God said, Pharaoh's heart will be hard. I will harden Pharaoh's heart. But that's an interesting thing to tell an unsure person. Listen, you're going to go back and you're going to talk to somebody and they're not going to listen to you. Okay. So why am I going to talk to them? I mean, well, listen, they're not going to listen to you. It's ironic. He's saying to him, it's not going to work. Pharaoh's going to reject your message again and again until, and he actually tells us what the 10th plague is right there, until I wind up with this Passover thing where the firstborn is the death angel comes by and takes the firstborn of all those who don't have the blood on the doorposts. It's almost like God knows that if Moses doesn't hear about, it's going to be hard, It's not going to work. It's going to take time. That Moses is going to, at the first failure, assume it all was for nothing and give up. So God starts to demonstrate to Moses his love, his kindness, his preparation, stretching his faith. And so as he starts on this journey, God is talking to him and giving him more as he goes. Not more than he could handle, but giving it to him as he could handle it. Because as we go on this journey, we can't handle all of it right away. I know you think you could, but God thinks you can't yet. And his thought for you comes through his love for you. So are you going to trust that God has given you everything you can handle right now? See, that's what God's doing here with Moses. Now, then we read this really interesting and off-putting story in verse 24 to 26. So read this along with me. It says this. So Moses on the road. At a lodging place along the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it. Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me, she said. So the Lord let him alone. At that time, she had said, bridegroom of blood, referring to circumcision. Well, that was interesting, right? Let's just move along, right? I don't know what to do with all of that. That seems a little bit out of place in the middle of the story there. The truth is that whole interaction, Hebrew is a pretty simple language. I mean, it's not like you would just read Hebrew. It's backwards. The letters don't look anything like our letters, but it's not a really complex language with lots of nuance to it. It's more of a narrative language. And so it's a pretty simple language, but this passage here is a really, really difficult one because there's a lot of pronouns that refer to something and we're not sure what they refer to. The words that we have in the NIV are an attempt to connect the dots a little bit, but what it exactly means is really intensely debated. So when you get into that, what I try to do is I step back from the details of it to maybe the whole point here. I try to look for the theme and the section in which it's put, because Moses, as he writes this, is writing it for a reason. He's writing it to illustrate something. And what we find out, what we know as we read this part of the story is this. Moses' sons do not have the sign of the covenant, the circumcision. Moses does. He was born in a Hebrew household, and God had given Abraham, and that was carried on through Isaac and Jacob and his sons, this sign of circumcision. But Moses has been away in Midian for 40 years, and he had sons born to him, and these sons did not have the sign of circumcision. That sign was a sign that says, we are God's people. We are separated. We are cut apart. We're taken away from the rest of the world. We are different from them. And this is the sign of our covenant. And Moses had not done this to his sons. Question is, why not? Moses is now on his way back to Egypt to identify with the people of God, but his sons don't have the most basic symbol. What does that tell you about Moses' mindset? He's kind of like, I'm not sure where this is all going. I'm not sure I want to put my sons on the line. And so we find God confronting him on the way. We don't know if God was about to kill Moses or about to kill his son or whatever, but God shows up and says, no more of this. This is the line in the sand. This is as far as it goes. Also, notice the theme of son in this passage. God has just talked about Israel as his son. Then he talked about Pharaoh's son. And now we're talking about Moses' son. And so there's this connection. God is about to invite Israel to follow him. Through Moses and Aaron, God is going to invite Israel to be children of God. This experience of being children of God. Not so much a title or a label as much as an idea of how we relate to our Creator. Moses is going to stand in front of Pharaoh and invite Pharaoh to know the true and living God, to worship and follow and obey the true and living God. And then we get to the messenger, the one who's going to produce all of this, Moses. And Moses, as he's going to go invite other people to follow God, he hasn't followed God yet. He has held back this simple act. I'm not saying it's an easy act, but it's a very simple act. It's almost like he's not sure where he and his family stand. And so his wife, Zipporah, She sees the importance, she sees the danger, and she acts. It's very clear that she performed the circumcision in response to God's confrontation, because his wife is like this: Moses, we're done being in the middle ground. We just packed everything up and we're on our way to Egypt. Let's stop playing around. Let's be all in. I'm already all in. I left my whole family, I left my homeland, and I'm with you heading back to Egypt. Let's stop playing this middle ground game. Don't we love to play the middle ground game? Where it's like, I would like for God to bless me, and I hope that if I go to church some Sundays and worship a little bit, that God will be on my side. But then I would also like to kind of be in charge of my life. I would like to do things that maybe God doesn't like that much, but I would like to do them because I think they're fun, or I don't want to miss out, or everybody else is doing it, or whatever. And right here in the middle, this is a moment where God says to Moses, Moses, your purpose doesn't allow you to be in the middle. And he confronts them. With deadly force, he confronts them. And he says, if you're not going to follow me, this is going to be the end, because there is no purpose for you halfway. So Moses' wife steps in. You know, Moses is not exactly a hero in this story, is he? His weakness, his struggle in faith, his choices, he puts them, as he writes Exodus, he puts them on display in front of us. But aren't you glad God can use someone like Moses? Here's God confronting him, showing him, teaching him, preparing him. And Moses is still holding back. And so you're like, wow, Moses, grab a clue. Like, turn the lights on. Let's go. Let's do this thing. What are you holding back for, Moses? And his wife, who didn't grow up in Israel and doesn't know all these things, she's like, let's just go all in. What are you holding back for? I'm so glad God could use Moses. And not just use him like, listen, I could do something with you. I don't know. You're such a mess. I could do something with you. Maybe it's a little thing. I'll give you a little purpose. But Moses is one of the biggest figures in the Old Testament. And this is where he starts that story. Like, I'm not even sure if I want to do this. I'm not sure how convinced I am of all this. I'm so glad that God can use Moses. I'm so glad that God was patient with Moses. And I'm so glad that God can use you. No matter what your doubts have been, no matter how much you've compromised and lived in the middle ground, no matter how long it has taken you, it took Moses 40 years. God can use you, and not just in a small way, but in a giant way that rocks history and has impact for generations to come. Moses is going to be front and center in this battle, in this invitation, in this line in the sand between you're on the side of God and you are not. And at that time, the division between those people is going to be marked by circumcision, those who are not God's people and those who are God's people. The consequences of the difference between those who aren't God's people and those who are is going to be death of the firstborn son. Moses experiences that whole danger before he gets to Egypt, because Moses is about to proclaim this and tell this. And so instead of it being theoretical or just something he heard about, it's something he has lived. He is being taught here that God's instructions are serious and have deadly consequences if you rebel against them. Moses is the first one asked whether he will follow God. Before he goes and puts the invitation out to others, will you be one of my people? And by the way, the choice is literally life or death. It is the reason Jesus came, because whether or not you are one of God's children is a choice between life or death. And I don't mean one of God's children like you're a human being created in the image of God. That's everybody. I mean whether you're one of God's children that bears the mark of God's children. In the Old Testament, that was circumcision. In the New Testament, that is the Spirit of the living God has come and lived in you because you received Jesus Christ as your Savior. It is not because you come to church. It's not because you call yourself a Christian. It's not because you think Jesus is a cool guy and said some good stuff. It's because you have come to that place where you've said, I am yours. I belong to you. And in doing that, you begin to follow him. And that choice has life or death consequences. There's going to come some time in your life, if you haven't made that choice or if you're hanging out in the middle ground, that God comes and confronts you. Later in the story, God's people will face this choice more than once. As they leave Egypt and as they go out into the wilderness, when they rebel against God, even though they have the sign of the covenant, God often comes at them and they place themselves in the zone of death from God. There's a time at the base of Mount Sinai. God's presence is up on the top of the mountain. They're down at the bottom building a golden calf. And people die because of that. Later on, there's a rebellion with a group of priests, and people die because of that. And over again, there's this idea of are you going to be my people or not? Sure, God is love. Absolutely. God is love. So much so that he sent Jesus, his son, to die in our place. God is love. But the reason he goes to such extremes is because what's at stake is life or death. And Christian, it's no different for you. Following him or not following him is life or death to you. Galatians chapter 6, don't be deceived. God is not mocked. What you sow, you will reap. If you sow to the flesh, you reap death. If you sow to the Spirit, you reap life. Many of us live in the death of our own making because we say we're children of God, but we don't follow him. And we don't think it's that big of a deal. God showed up along the road with Moses and said, it's a big deal. You need to decide that you're in. And so we see God preparing Moses. The last preparation is that he meets his brother Aaron. Verse 27. The Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. So he met Moses at the mountain of God and kissed him. Then Moses told Aaron everything the Lord had sent him to say, and also about all the signs he had commanded him to perform. So now, one of the things about this preparation is God had told him, I will use Aaron, and Aaron is in some way just a representation of Moses' doubts and fears, and God says, fine, I'll use Aaron to go along with you. But Moses meets Aaron, and he tells him all the things that he heard, which when you think about it is exactly what he's going to be doing when he gets back to Egypt. So it's like there's this dress rehearsal before they get to the main event. It's like God is still preparing Moses. One of the ways he's preparing him is you're not alone. You've got a wife who's with you. Clearly, she's with you. And now you've got a brother who's with you. Some of us, the preparation isn't exactly about my faith or my standing or my maturity. It's about my connection. How connected am I to the people that God needs to bring as a part of this story? How meaningfully connected? It's one of the reasons we do small group. It's one of the reasons that we fellowship and we have like a cafe tonight, because connectedness matters. Some of your purpose and some of the preparation for your purpose is you finding a way to be meaningfully connected to the people that God has for your life and your purpose. And so you might, I know everything I'm supposed to know. I don't know why I'm stuck here in the middle ground. Do you know everyone you're supposed to know? And have you built the kind of relationships that you need to have with them? The chapter closes out with the news. Verse 27 down, or verse 29 down to verse 31, it says this: Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of the Israelites. And Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. And when they heard the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped. All of this preparation leads to this moment. And for Moses, he thinks it's the moment. I get in front of the elders of Israel, and I stand here and I tell you that God is going to deliver you. And that's what God has sent me to do. He doesn't know that this is just the warm-up. This is just a small piece. This is something we easily and quickly forget as the story begins to unfold. But it was Moses' main concern back on the mountain. What will the people think of me? And so now it makes a lot of sense that Aaron's with him, because they know Aaron. They don't know Moses, but they know Aaron. And Aaron says, this is my brother, and brings him before him. And Aaron speaks on behalf of Moses. It's this advantage that God has given Moses that Moses didn't even realize he needed. His fear of rejection turns out to be unfounded. Now Moses begins to step into God's call. He begins to follow and trust. That moment on the road with God seems to have been the difference between I don't know where I stand and I am ready to be all in. At the end of this chapter, we see Israel respond, although they waver as time goes on. Next up, it's going to be Pharaoh's chance to respond. And all this happens because God prepared Moses for what God had as Moses' purpose. What's this mean for us? Maybe you've been hanging out in the middle ground with God. You're content to be favorably inclined toward God. That's enough. I like God. I think he's good. I worship him. I'm thankful that I'm saved. But God is not a real part of your life. Maybe you've segregated out parts. My business, that's mine. My Christianity, my relationship with God doesn't come in there. My home, that's mine. My sexuality, that's mine. My money, that's mine. You're not all in. This is a call from a story over 3,500 years old that says to you, God is still the same God. And he says, listen, it's not going to work halfway in. It only works when you go all in. Middle ground is a deadly place to stay. And so God is inviting you all in. We celebrate Christmas. Jesus came to this earth. Did Jesus go all in? I mean, we think about the cross. Certainly he gave everything on the cross, but he didn't just pop in and out of earth. I'll just show up here and there. He came as a baby. He left heaven and came. He went all in this human thing. And he lived on earth for decades before he started his ministry. He was all in, even in the incarnation. And we follow him. And so I'm saying to you, believers, there is no priority in your life except this one. Every other priority is subservient to this. Every other priority is only a way to reflect this priority, that God is my life, that he is a faithful and good God, that he is my Redeemer and my Savior and my peace and my hope, that my life belongs to him, that I have given myself to him. And no matter where he takes me, I will trust him. I will give myself to him because there is no one else that I belong to except my God. Maybe it's that moment for you to get out of the middle ground and to go all in. Or maybe for you today, it's an encouragement that where you are and where you've been so discouraged is just because you are in preparation, not at the payoff, not at your purpose yet. And you're like, what's going on? Why isn't anything happening? Where's this all going? And I'm just saying to you, maybe you just need to shift in your brain a little bit to faith that says, God is still working to prepare me, and I don't know what for, but preparation often looks nothing like where it will wind up. God knows what he's doing, and so what I'm going to invite you to do today is just trust God. Let God gently and slowly prepare you for what he has for you. Even when it feels like scary, hard, when you think, well, I'm stuck, even then, God, I trust you. You are at work preparing me for something that you want to do through my life, and I am good with that. I will trust you today.